Hello, I'm Stuart Crainer, co-founder of Thinkers50. Welcome to our weekly LinkedIn Live session, celebrating some of the brightest new stars in the world of management thinking. In January, we announced the Thinkers50 Radar community for 2024. These are the upcoming management thinkers we believe individuals and organizations should be listening to. The 2024 list was our most eclectic, challenging yet. This year's Radar is brought to you in partnership with Deloitte and features business thinkers from the worlds of fashion, retailing, branding, and communications, as well as statisticians, neuroscientists, and platform practitioners from the Nordics to New Zealand and Asia to America. Over the next few weeks, we will be meeting some more of these fantastic thinkers in our weekly sessions. So we hope you can join us for some great conversations. As always, please let us know where you are joining us from today and send in any comments, questions, queries, or observations at any time during the session. Our guest today is Hatim Rahman. Hatim is an assistant professor of management and organizations at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. His research investigates how artificial intelligence, undergirded by algorithms, is impacting the nature of work and employment relationships in organizations and labor markets. His research and teaching have received numerous awards. In 2023, he was named as one of the best 40 business school professors under 40 by Poets and Quants. Hatim's book, Inside the Invisible Cage: How Algorithms Control Workers, is coming out in September, published by the University of California Press. So this is really an exclusive look at the forthcoming book. Hatim, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Can you tell us about the genesis of the research and the Inside the Invisible Cage? How's your research evolved over the 10 years previous?
Sure. So I started really my research career at Stanford, and I was in the engineering school in a program called Management Science and Engineering. And I love that program because it really tries to bring together research, insights, practitioners at the intersection of technology and management. And so when I was there, a lot of the engineers were working on and with organizations building digital platforms such as Uber, Upwork, Fiverr, Lyft, Amazon, you name it. And there is this current going on that, especially again, back in like 2012, 2013, that the future of work is going to be controlled by AI and algorithms. And to some degree, they're viewing it as an optimization problem, just as you would, a product market or other things like that. And I was frankly caught up a little bit in the rhetoric and that agenda, and thinking about this really could be the future of work. And I think it is, but as I started to do my research, my advisor in my group has always been centered, let's look at a phenomenon from many different lenses, right? Because if you look at it through one lens, you could see it as an optimization problem. But if you look at it through another lens, you see, especially what I started to focus on high-skilled online labor markets like Upwork, Fiverr, top coders, where they were trying to build an eBay for high-skilled work. So the idea was that just like you could find a product with searching the internet, you should be able to find any high-skilled workers, a professor, a statistician, you name it, you could find them on these types of platforms. And so that's what really got me interested in looking at these platforms and more through a different lens and speaking to workers. How are they experiencing the platforms in their day-to-day experiences?
So really, your story is one of how we view the technology and the way it has changed. In that 10 years ago, when you started work in this area, the technology, AI in particular, was seen as it would replace the mundane and repetitive jobs. It wasn't seen as having an impact on managerial jobs, effectively. Okay. But over recent time, there's been increasing realization that the technology has an impact on managerial jobs as well.
That's right. And one insight that kind of cuts across mine and others' research is that when you look at technology's impact on management in organizations, there's two central insights that I think are important. One that come through my research and others. One is that a lot of technology encodes and amplifies organizational values and priorities. What I mean by that is that, if an organization values efficiency over other outcomes, that usually gets reflected in how they design and implement technology, versus trying to on other types of outcomes like worker well-being or so on and so forth. It's not an either or, but again, it does reflect what is prioritized. The second thing that I think my research and others also highlights is that technology very rarely will replace an entire profession, which is kind of the fear that is often articulated in the media. There's a study that I often cite in my talks that since the 1950s, only one occupation out of 270 has been eliminated by automation, which is the elevator operator. What that generally shows, going to your question, is that it's usually the nature of work that's going to change for all types of workers, right? The way we are doing this interview looks very different than even probably what it would have been 10 years ago. So yeah, we've seen now with AI that the kind of the scope and the scale of the workers and the nature of the work that is going to change has increased quite significantly.
It's interesting because they're kind of profound issues, aren't they?
Yeah.
So forgive me, Hatim, if I kind of go back over what you said and try and decode it.
Sure.
Technology is an expression of an organization's values. The way they use the technology is an expression of their values. Is really interesting in itself.
Yeah, and that's I don't know if I can connect it back to my book when I'm bringing forward this metaphor, the invisible cage. Whereas in the gig economy and platform, what I have seen in my research as well as others is that there was this priority and value to try to maximize, again, like optimize matches and engagement and interaction, which again at a very high level makes sense, right? Like, why wouldn't you want to try to match people and so on and so forth? But it overlooks a lot of workers' well-being, how they interpreted and felt about being subject to algorithms and AI that could change without notice, recourse, or explanation. And so that's where I kind of brought forward this metaphor for a lot of workers in the gig economy and increasingly beyond. Their experience is like being in an invisible cage where, again, the rules and guidelines for what is rewarded is opaque and changing. Whereas it doesn't have to necessarily be like that, right? AI and algorithms, organizations can make them transparent. They can reveal their data sources. Of course, there's always competing interests that are there, but I want to, with my research and in the book, kind of really highlight what our organization's prioritizing. We may get to this with generative AI as well, but I think it's very much reflective with that technology as well.
So really, it's kind of, so your research kind of explains that employers can use algorithms to shift rules and guidelines without notice, explanation, or recourse for workers. So that's where it's so opaque and ever changing. So they're in a no-win situation, aren't they?
That's right. And again, from one of the reasons why there's this justification or there's this rationale to make them opaque and dynamic is, so I kind of trace this through in my book as well, is that a lot of really the online world has been heavily influenced by eBay. So going back to the early mid 90s, they were very much a pioneer in facilitating online transactions and scaling it at a global level, right? Like right now it's routine that we can buy products and interact with people, but back then people were not sure how could I trust buying, what a VHS perhaps back then, right, from somebody I've never met. And they rolled out the 5-star rating system, right, as a mechanism to try to give a sense for people who don't necessarily know each other, how trustworthy is this person that I'm buying from. And it for a certain time period it worked well, but almost all platforms, Airbnb, Uber, again, Upwork, Fiverr, they kind of copy and paste that model initially. But one of the lines I have in my book is that people are not products, right? You took something that worked well for a certain time period in a product market and applied it in a labor market, and you saw consequences of it. So one thing that has happened throughout time, especially back in the 2010s and so on and so forth, is that these rating systems were very easily manipulated, gamed by workers, by outside actors, and we saw that on social media as well, right? And so the response of a lot of online platforms was to shift to make these rating systems, evaluation systems, these algorithms more opaque. So again, it makes sense for initially for why they did so, but kind of what my book highlights is that it tilted too far into the opacity direction, where it created this invisible case. So in the book, I try to articulate how to maybe find a medium behind the initial start, when everything was very transparent, easy to understand, but subject to gaming and manipulation, and where we kind of find ourselves right now, where it's opaque and no one understands, is your book going to be absorbed by a generative AI system and someone's going to copy and paste it in, right? Like that. I think a lot of people agree, like that's not where we want to be or where we want to go.
And you had a spell working in data science at Airbnb. I mean, that's 10 years ago or more, but how did that inform the development of your research?
That's a great question. So I think there are two things. One was that when I was doing my PhD, I was doing some computational social science work. And so one was just being there was really amazing in terms of the people that they brought in. The data science team I worked with to this day are some of the brightest, most curious people that I was interacting with. But one thing that also stood out, at that time, there were concerns about how Airbnb was impacting local communities, people who don't have access to housing. I was looking for that conversation to happen and seeing what type of research was going on. And it was there, but not necessarily at the forefront, right? So grappling with, at least to me, right? I mean, of course, I can't speak for Airbnb or anything like that, but from my observation of being there, I didn't see that at the forefront. And a lot of my friends and others who have subsequently left have talked about this as well, is that there wasn't enough of a reckoning. And you see that now with New York and other cities around the world, including in Europe, putting much stricter guidelines and guardrails around how Airbnb can be implemented. But it kind of keyed me into, like, again, we've got to be looking at the implications of these technologies and these platforms with multiple voices and stakeholders in the room.
And presumably the danger is that we are excited and seduced by the technology and don't give any thought to the implications for a broad group of stakeholders.
Yeah, so this is going back to the earlier theme that we kind of started the discussion with, is that a technology's features or its capabilities very rarely is the main determinant for predicting its impact, right? It goes back to the organizational values and priorities, right? And I give this example in many ways, right? So the technology or the technology for pilots, right, to automate their flying experience or their work has existed for quite some time, right? I teach this in my class back in, I think, like 2016, 18, there's an article about how the technology exists to automate a flight. But for lots of reasons, we haven't taken pilots out of the cockpit, right? Instead, even if you look at how pilots are trained, they have to learn all of how to fly a plane manually, and the technology comes in to enhance, ideally, and we've seen that, to enhance what they do, right? They haven't made a decision, oh, because it can automate what we can do, we're going to reduce our training requirements, we're going to reduce our safety requirements. They haven't made that, even though, again, the capabilities of the technology can automate a lot of what they do. So I use that example to say that even in any profession going forward, if the capabilities exist to automate, which again rarely happens, it doesn't mean it has to negatively affect the entire occupation or the industry, right? We can choose as organizations, as occupations, as a society, to figure out ways to enhance the way people do their work.
There are still a few elevator operators left.
So one of my teaching assistants this year emailed me and told me that they saw an elevator operator in Chicago as well. So I may have to correct that statement as well.
But it's an interesting thing, though, isn't it? That jobs that have been, professions that have been wiped out is a very small number.
Yeah. I mean, and to be, that's usually to spur conversations to the earlier point, that the nature of work often changes, right? The distribution of work or professions changes, right? We don't have the same distribution of professions in 1950s as we do today. We have very different types of work, new types of jobs. And so what some of my emerging research is looking at is that, given that technology in aggregate creates more jobs than it displaces, a lot of economists and other scholars have shown that, who is getting access to those jobs? I think is one of the most important questions for that has preceded and going forward, given what the capabilities that we've seen with emerging AI and other technologies.
So that's the crucial point, isn't it? That technology in the end creates jobs.
Yeah. So in the aggregate, right? Like when we look at the macro trend, really the question that my research and others are bringing to the forefront is, again, what is the path that we're going to go on while those jobs are created, right? So in the US, in the UK, and others, in the last 30 years, we've seen a hollowing out of a lot of middle income jobs, right? And in ways that haven't necessarily been beneficial, or some of those top jobs are generally go towards people like us who already have many advantages with our education and with our networks. And so, again, thinking through how can we have people who have traditionally been left behind? How can we ensure, again, how can organizations help ensure that workers that have been left behind also have access to those new jobs by upskilling, reskilling, so on and so forth?
Yeah. Alexandra from Poland says, how about customer service workers? Many have been let go and replaced by bots.
So that's a really interesting comment, observation. So I would also say on that point too that it reflects organizational values. So I think very often when I'm driving my car, I hear this advertisement from Discover, I believe. I'm not. Don't quote me on this, but one of the major credit card companies, they say that if you call our customer service, you will talk to a live human being, right? And we saw recently with Air Canada, they did try to replace some of their customer service with kind of ChatGPT, generative AI, and it backfired, right? Because it quoted an incorrect policy and so on and so forth. So I do think that some of the smartest organizations are figuring out how to ensure and use technology to enhance their customer service. But to the earlier comment, there are definitely organizations that are using it to kind of replace customer service. I would say that I haven't seen aggregate data yet to understand where the shift has on aggregate what is happening. But at least anecdotally, we're seeing what some of the insight I said earlier, that it's going around what organizations value. Just one more comment on this. When I was at Airbnb, one of the most technologically advanced organizations, I think, in the world, the largest group at that time was their customer service group, because they wanted to make a distinguishing factor that when you call Airbnb, often you're calling it to resolve very complicated issues. I can't find the key, I can't get in touch with the host, so on and so forth. And they could have made a choice to automate that. Oh, tell me about your problem. But they, at that time, they made a choice to really emphasize the ability to talk to a live human being.
Yeah, so that goes back to your earlier point, Hatim, about technology is an expression of organizational values, and in one way or another.
That's right.
Somebody from LinkedIn says, how do algorithmic management systems impact the autonomy and decision-making abilities of workers in various industries?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we've seen it. So in my own work, a lot of it is tied to the employment relationship. So independent contractors, ones who are kind of generally freelancers and contractors, it's significantly decreased their autonomy from my own research has shown. Whereas in organizations where their workers are generally full-time employees, higher skilled, such as in finance, in some degrees even in education and consulting, there has been an attempt to try to allow to use algorithms to enhance autonomy and decision making. So broadly speaking, I've seen it fall along the lines of employment relationship.
And a lot of your research kind of focuses on the gig economy, Hatim. And is the gig economy, is it a good? I mean, fundamentally, it gets a lot of bad press. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? And are there examples of organizations utilizing the gig economy in responsible, ethical, and sustainable ways?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And one of the reasons why I feel fortunate to have been studying the gig economy, because it's been a microcosm for a lot of the issues that have been at the forefront of society: autonomy, decision making. Is it good or bad for society? And as a researcher, I will say that it is a mixed bag, right? So let me just give an example that I think is more accessible to people: social media. It has allowed people and voices to come to the forefront in ways that I think we can all agree have been altering for the way that we think about issues, the way that we think about conflicts, the way that we think about business and society. And we want to retain that. We want to retain the ability for historically marginalized voices and groups to be able to amplify their voices through social media, so on and so forth. At the same time, as we've seen with elections and other situations and scenarios, those same systems can be hijacked or can be used to amplify disinformation, hatred, what some research says, amplify moral outrage, right? We want to dial that down, right? Theoretically speaking, and that's where my research and others come in, is how do we optimize for some of the benefits that we've seen with gig economy and social media, while also recognizing, in what my work and others, that there are distinct harms and drawbacks that have come across. And so, to answer your question, I think we haven't found the optimal ways, but there are emerging solutions that are there. I've spoken in my book and others that there are worker cooperatives that are coming up that are trying to provide that flexibility and autonomy that the gig economy provides, while also trying to enhance and maintain the autonomy and decision making that the previous question was highlighting.
Yeah, we've talked about in previous sessions with Leon Prieto and Simone Phipps and their work on cooperative advantage, and you've done work about, as you say, Hatim, about worker cooperatives. Do you think they're liable to increase in number? What are the trends there?
So we definitely see a lot more interest and energy around it. The biggest barrier is that scaling these types of initiatives takes a lot of resources, right? If you look at where a lot of the emerging technology is coming in the platforms, it very highly correlates with the organizations and platforms that have been able to get access to lots of resources, right? In terms of not just monetary, but human capital, investors. So to answer your question directly, I do see a lot of initiatives coming up. But one of the biggest questions is, will they be able to scale? And it's not just up to them, right? It's will organizations, businesses, governments, given them the resources. As others have pointed out, a lot of the largest organizations, including Tesla and Google, they have benefited from regulation in the U.S. and other countries, right? That they played a very key role in allowing them to scale at that time. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest questions. What at the intersection of these initiatives, what will regulation, what will investors, what will that mix look like to be able to hopefully scale some of these alternatives?
One issue we haven't talked about is the impact of the pandemic, which I presume it expanded the invisible cage.
Yeah. So to your point, that in the pandemic, when a lot of work went remote, many organizations that, again, kind of looking at their, if you look at their values and priorities, they also began to implement opaque algorithms that have a very large consequences on people's careers. One of the biggest areas that I'm seeing this, not just in the gig economy, is with AI hiring systems. In speaking to workers and my students, it accelerated quite a bit in the pandemic, but the way that they are implemented, the way that they make decisions is often opaque to workers. And that some emerging research has shown that many of these systems disproportionately negatively impact, again, historically marginalized groups, people with darker skin, women, for often reasons that almost always, I should say, that had nothing to do with their skill and capability and the fit with their job, but instead for reasons that are opaque, but often are reflected in past biases that exist in organizations and these systems. So yes, I have seen a acceleration of industry-wide of using kind of opaque technologies in ways that really the consequences we're still grappling with.
A question from somebody on LinkedIn, Hatim. How can organizations foster a culture of trust and collaboration amidst the increasing reliance on AI and algorithms for workforce management?
Yeah, that's a great question.
It's the killer question, isn't it?
Yeah. So let me try to answer it as directly as possible. One theme that I and many other researchers have talked about is that the design in building that trust around technology has been in the hands of a very few stakeholders, often people with homogeneous backgrounds, right? Data science, computer science. And one thing that I say, and again, I was in Silicon Valley. It's not that maybe I'm a little bit naive in this. I do think people have a good intention when building these tools, but there has to be a recognition that no one group or expert can figure it out, especially in the design of these technologies. So to answer your question directly, I think it's essential to bring in diverse experts and stakeholders in the design phase. Often it's brought in, but too late, when the consequential decisions have already been made. And so that's one way to do so. The other thing that we try to bring forward in our research is that, again, it's very hard for a single organization or group to figure it out all on their own. And so I do think that there is a role for crowdsourced accountability systems. We have seen that really help a lot with sustainability and even in higher education, right? To some degree, like if you think about US News rankings and Financial Times rankings, technically an organization, university doesn't have to pay attention to them, right? But they've become very powerful in making organizations change to try to meet those types of criteria. So one of my ideas I propose in the book, also in other work as well, is trying to get crowdsourced accountability systems, given how difficult it can be to get organizations to bring in diverse stakeholders or governments. By kind of design, governments are reactive in nature, right? And so that's another potential solution that I see that can help bring forward more trust in these systems.
I think there's another question, which I think you've kind of answered really, Hatim, to some extent. How can educators and policymakers ensure that the implementation of AI technologies in the education system promotes inclusivity, equity, and accessibility for all students, regardless of their backgrounds or learning needs?
Yeah. I mean, as an educator, I think very deeply about this, and to answer that question, and again tying to the earlier themes, one essential question is what are the key learning objectives and goals of the class and the learning, and then figuring out how to ensure, again, you can use technology to enhance that way, right? So if it in my own class, for example, I prioritize to some degree in-class interaction and discussion, but I recognize that not everyone is comfortable participating live or in the moment. And so I try to offer through technology other alternative ways. You can submit your thoughts after class. You can send me articles that are in your wheelhouse. And also, I do make the recording of my class available to students because people learn at different speeds or in different ways, right? Um, so I think thinking very deeply, and kind of what I mentioned earlier, is talking to students, talking to student services, talking to colleagues. You would think it happens more, but you'd be surprised because we're all busy, we're doing different things. It doesn't happen enough. So creating those spaces where you can encourage diverse voices to come in, I think is really important. And thinking about, again, ensuring that people have the right incentives, because again, all of these people are busy, they're doing their own work. So thinking about how we can create spaces and incentives to bring these voices in an ongoing manner. It's not a one-shot thing, right? So when you mentioned the pandemic, how I was trying to promote inclusivity when everyone was remote looks very different when we're coming back, and recognizing that people still have vulnerability to different diseases that are spreading, and how can we accommodate learners that are there as well.
Another question from LinkedIn, thanks Hatim for that, is how can organizations balance the need for efficiency and productivity with the ethical concerns surrounding the use of algorithms in managing and evaluating employees? And I suppose that's the efficiency and ethical balancing act is a constant. Yeah. And I guess that's always been the case. And I was thinking, as you were talking earlier about organizational decisions, in some ways they've always been opaque for ordinary workers.
Yeah. So let me hit on that point for a second. So I think you are correct. They have it's not necessarily new. I mean, one thing that I'm trying to bring to light is that with these technologies, with algorithms and AI, the opacity scales and is dynamic, scales such that often people designing the systems don't even know how they work now, right? So there is a survey that I show in class, like over 60% of execs don't know how the AI systems that they're thinking about or using work. That's problematic, not just for the people who are subject to these systems, but organizations themselves and the leaders, right? But going to that question earlier, so as you mentioned, there has always been this competing priorities of efficiency and skill versus slowing down and ensuring that we are inclusive and we build trust. I guess my argument, looking across industries, is that rebalancing to slow down in the long term is beneficial. So we've seen that with sustainability as well, right? If you think about if we had been listening to the voices across the world in indigenous communities that have been saying that we need to foreground sustainability in our construction, in the way that we interact with our environment at that time, right? A lot of the problems that we're encountering right now would likely be at least mitigated to some extent. So I'm not going to make the argument that in the short term, I'm going to be able to convince organizations that slowing down is going to help their bottom line. I mean, we've seen that very rarely works. But I think that if you are able to think about the longer term view, because the implications of longer term are not just for the organization, but they reverberate across communities and societies, right? So my argument is that for organizations, that in the long term for themselves as well, it's much more beneficial to figure these issues out now, because, again, bringing in diverse voices, diverse expertise will lead to breakthroughs in the long run.
I suppose a related question is, where is best practice? Where are algorithms actually setting workers free? Are there any good examples?
Yeah, I think that so there is a movement called AI for good, right? So I think that's the way to do it. So for example, in class, I talk about how researchers have used AI to detect modern slavery, using AI to try to track, so again, going back to the earlier question, like what objectives are we thinking about? Sustainability, right? To try to find organizations that are skirting emissions rules, right? There are AI systems that are being used to deploy to try to optimize for societal beneficial outcomes. So I do think there are examples that are being forward. And going back to the example that I mentioned for hiring, there are some organizations, and one of the reasons I'm hesitant to name them is because things change so fast, right? That instead of using it to enhance their current processes, they're using it to try to expand the pool of workers that they are considering. So, organizations and humans are limited in how many people and how many resumes and how many schools and how many cities they can visit, but turning it around and saying, how can we use AI systems to allow people from anywhere in the world to apply? And perhaps even give them feedback if they don't end up going in that direction, right? So I think those are some promising examples of instead of looking at how do we kind of narrow the skill pipeline, how do we expand it and bring in people who we could never necessarily bring in and assess given the limitations of organizations and humans.
So where does your research go now, Hatim? What are you working on at the moment?
That's a great question. So there are two projects that I'm very excited about. One is the one that I mentioned earlier, is that especially in the pandemic, we saw that, I believe it was Intel, they said that 50% of their jobs, it was IBM or Intel, would no longer require a 4-year college degree. And so there was some momentum and excitement that, again, so in the US, for example, 60% of adults don't have a 4-year college degree. And so thinking more about how can we get more diverse voices, particularly those who have been historically left out, access to those higher paying jobs that are created by new technology. So thinking about workforce development, retraining, reskilling in the age of AI. So that's one area that I have very active with my students and collaborators that we're trying to pursue. The second project that I also want to emphasize and highlight is that we are going back to the earlier questions of like, how do we design more inclusive AI and technology? So we're trying to study this in a healthcare organization that is trying to design and build an AI system for ultrasounds for low and middle income countries. So a lot of people don't have access to healthcare. And going back to the question that, AI for good, to your earlier question. So in the healthcare space, I think there are a lot of great efforts to try to design these technologies to allow people to get access to care. But going to the earlier example, so the project that we're observing is that a lot of complications that happen in birth are preventable if people have access to higher access ultrasound and imaging. And so the project that we're following is that they're trying to design an AI system so that really anyone with this ultrasound probe could scan a fetus, and then that probe would be able to predict and give you insight into how healthy the fetus is. Are there complications occurring? So that if there are complications occurring, then people can go where they don't traditionally have access to healthcare. They could go and access expert healthcare providers and hopefully mitigate the consequences to the fetus and the mother that have that potential complication. And so that's exciting because again, we're looking at the very early stage at the design phase and trying to understand how they're able to ensure that the AI system can be used by diverse populations and stakeholders. So a little bit of on the labor market and AI in organizations as well.
And are you optimistic that we'll begin to use algorithms in positive ways and that AI will work for good?
I think you have to have some form of optimism, at least for me in my research, to be able to push forward. And I am optimistic in that I do think it's somewhat of a push and pull, right? I mentioned earlier transparency and opacity. I have been encouraged by initial regulation. In the U.S., there's been a proposal by the Biden administration, Alondra Nelson and others, about an AI Bill of Rights. Right, the European Union is also very proactive and trying to think more proactively, in part because of what we've experienced with the gig economy and social media, right? So I am optimistic, not just with my nature, but also with some of the initiatives that we're seeing globally, to try to create a better balance, to create mutually beneficial outcomes that allow for greater productivity, but also in ways that are beneficial for workers and lower power groups that have been historically left behind.
Yeah, I guess one issue from what you said, Hatim, are these issues universal, or are the different cultures and nations interpret them in different ways? I mean, is there consistency in the way that workers' rights are treated throughout the world?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, the short answer is there is nuance, right? There's nuance that are beneficial, right? So some large players like European Union and other countries around the world that do put workers at the forefront and hold organizations accountable for their kind of goals and outcomes. It can reverberate, right? If you want to be able to play in certain countries and certain regions, you have to meet these criteria. Well, that can reverberate to other countries that have weaker protections, right? If you make the changes here, and it works in ways that are beneficial, then it kind of allows organizations to see the benefits and ideally roll those out in a global way. And I think this is really important, as you mentioned, because with the gig economy, with sustainability, with a lot of issues, they aren't just local issues, right? They affect workers globally. So it's not I'm not an expert in all the countries, but broadly from my reading of the research, there is important nuance that will hopefully help create those mutually beneficial outcomes.
Lots of food for thought. Hatim Rahman, thank you very much. I like crowdsourced accountability systems. Irresistible idea.
Thanks. and it builds on, again, I want to give credit to a lot of other researchers who have also been talking about this as well.
Yeah. Hatim, thank you very much. Hatim's book, Inside the Invisible Cage, will be released in September this year by University of California Press. So make sure you pre-order that and check out Hatim's work elsewhere as well. Hatim, thank you very much for joining us. Lots of food for thought. Really appreciate the conversation.
Thanks, Stuart, and thanks for everyone for their questions.
Thank you.